This is the DeLongTODAY briefing. I am Brad DeLong, an economics professor at the University of California at Berkeley and a sometime Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. This is the weekly DeLongTODAY briefing. Here I hold forth on the Lee Bureau's Vimeo platform on my guesses as to what I think you most need to know about what our economy is doing to us right now. I promised Wes Neff, when he agreed to provide the infrastructure for this, that I and my briefings would be lively, interesting, curious, thoughtful, and relatively brief. Relatively brief. I promised I'd provide briefings on a mix of forecasting, politics, macroeconomic analysis, history, and political economy. Today is an economic history briefing. Right now, the bottom 10% of the world's population, the bottom 800 million, they have levels of material comfort and social power that significantly differ in two and only two respects from those of our pre-industrial ancestors. One, they have access to modern public health, which has at least doubled and perhaps tripled life expectancy. Two, they have at least some access to the modern world's communications and calculation infrastructure. These are, no doubt about it, huge deals. But as for the rest, even though the world is so much smaller a place today than it was 2 centuries ago, back when it took 4 months to go from London to Calcutta, only a small part of the world has been able to take anything like full advantage of modern technologies for manipulating nature and effectively organizing humans. The top tenth, the tenth that has the global north, the top 800 million people, today we have a standard of living averaging $50,000 per year, and some of us much more than that. We, as an 800 million slice of civilization, have at least 50 times the living standards of the bottom tenth and of our pre-industrial ancestors. And depending on how you think you should measure, the index number problems are insuperable, potentially much, much more. Now, how did this come about? I guess, I do not really know, but I am arrogant enough to think that my guesses as to this are the best on the planet. I am a trained professional here, and this is my day job after all. So let me start by providing some broad perspective. Here are some numbers and a graph. Life expectancy at birth and real annual income per capita by country in 1800 or 1975. Now, here especially, I think it is important to note that the map is not the territory. These numbers are not real. These numbers are not real for two reasons. First, they are only guesses. Second, it is not conceptually clear what meaningful one-dimensional quantity the income per capita figure could possibly be a guess of. Life expectancy we have nailed. Income per capita? John Maynard Keynes used to poke fun at people who ignored index number problems, saying they were trying to quantify by how much, quote, Queen Victoria was a better queen but not a happier woman than Queen Elizabeth, unquote, and that while such comparisons were, quote, not without meaning and not without interest, unquote, they were definitely, quote, unsuitable as material for the differential calculus, unquote. And he denounced claims to mock precision, and he would go to town on this graph and these numbers here. Nevertheless, a map is a guide to the territory. What does this map guide us to? Well, the solid part of it is that between 1800 and 1975, life expectancy rose from the age 25 to 40 to 50 to 75. nearly doubling worldwide and doing much, much better in the global north. Second, incomes, as we measure them, grow massively. Japan times 19. America times 13. Brazil times 6. Britain, Turkey times 7. Britain times 6. But Nigeria times 4. And not because Nigeria was already ahead, already rich in 1800. India times only 1.4 from 1800 to 1975. China times only 1.3. Mozambique times only 1.2. Now, these 1800 to 1975 numbers are simply bonkers. They are bonkers in two ways. First, consider Britain. Annual real income per capita in today's dollars of $19,000 a year in 1975, and $40,000 a year today, on average. Modern economic growth has, since 1975, continued for another generation and a half. Compare that to 3280 in 1800. Tenfold multiplication of wealth over a century and 2/3. This had to be a very new thing. For one thing, back in 1800, Britons were spending 25% of their income on 2,000 calories per day plus essential nutrients. If we project back from 1800 to 1625 at the 1800 to 1975 pace, we find that Britons then would have needed to spend 2.5 times their income on pure nutritional necessities, or simply die of starvation. Now, as best as we can tell, Britons back in 1800. Britons back in 1800 had about the same lifespan, about the same income per capita level that Britons had much, much earlier. Than Britons had back in 1680, which were the same as 1570, which were the same as 1430. Humans were inventive, but all of their inventiveness had gotten them nothing in terms of higher living standards for construction workers between 1430 and 1800. Industrial Revolution scale growth, the kind we got over the two generations from 1800 to 1870, it was a very new thing for the world. Although it did not trickle down to construction workers, it definitely trickled up to Britain's rich. And then around 1870, things changed again worldwide, a notably faster pace of growth since 1870 than before. Simon Kuznets called it modern economic growth, and very sharply distinguished it from what had happened during the 1800 to 1870 classical British Industrial Revolution age. So that's one bonkers thing. The second way in which these numbers are bonkers, is the extraordinary divergence we see. In 1800, the range of the world's economies and material prosperity was a factor of at most 7. $500 per year to $3,500 per year per capita at our prices notionally. And almost all countries were within a factor of 2.5 of each other. 1975, the range is a factor of 40, and fully 20 of that range, you need to go to a range of 20 to get the lion's share of world population. Yet these 175 years are the 175 years it took the time it took to travel from Britain to India fall from 4 months to 12 hours. It saw the time it took to talk from Britain to India fall from a year to a second. It saw the labor time costs of transporting goods from Britain to India fall by a factor of 50. The coming first of the iron-hulled, screw-propellered, coal-fired cargo ship, and then of containerization, meant that technological progress in transport vastly outraged the average. Talking, moving, shipping around the world was vastly cheaper in 1975 than it had been in 1800. People are very good at spreading ideas. In fact, anyone who has reflected on the human drive to gossip, even when you know you really shouldn't, knows how hard it is to stop humans from sharing ideas. We are what we have evolved to be, an anthology intelligence with the anthology nature mediated by our mouths, our ears, and our language. And yet only a small part of the world was able in 1975 to fully grasp the technologies of nature manipulation and human organization for prosperity that were developed between 1800 and 1975. Most of the world, for the Yellow, Yangtze, Mekong, Brahmaputra, Ganges, Indus watersheds and their surrounds, the countries who are well proxied by China and India, look to have barely grasped any of it between 1800 and 1875. Why? Now, things were to change substantially after 1975. From 1975 to today, the Brazils, the Turkeys, the Nigerias, the Mozambiques, on average, they keep pace in their growth with the North Americas, Britons, and Japans. Real income per capita there, as a fraction of real income per capita in the global north, is about the same as it was in 1975. They have not diverged from, they have grown along the global north. But then again, they have not as a group converged. While divergence is no longer one of the most powerful features of the world economy, convergence isn't either. Some countries have grown slower than average, others have grown faster than the pace setters of the global north, but the geometric average of the global south, with each country counted for one, does not draw closer to that of the global north. With, of course, two exceptions. There are two countries that count for only 1/100th of the number of countries in the global south, but their populations count for half of the global south. India between 1975 and 2020. Really, I think, starting when Rajiv Gandhi becomes prime minister and starts the dismantling of the so-called license Raj. Real incomes per capita multiplying sixfold on average in India as North America slightly more than doubles. Yes, it's accompanied by rising inequality. Yes, it's accompanied by social stresses that have put Indian democracy in doubt. Yes, the government of India today seems to be something that I can only classify as an unpleasant national Hinduism, where they are thinking of casting India's Muslims in the role in which European nationalists traditionally cast the Jews. And a lot of that is driven by the speed of change and the inequality of change. Nevertheless, India, material economic progress, Indians living better in a material welfare sense than they did in 1975, you look at that and you say, wow. And of course, China. Starting with Deng Xiaoping's accession to paramount leadership, and his beginning to cross the ford by feeling with one's feet for the stones. China, 20-fold richer today than in 1975. An income level today of $18,000 per capita per year on average. Richer than Britain was in 1975, richer than America was in the late 1950s. Wow, oh wow, oh wow. Nothing like this ever before, ever. That's what happened. A lot of good news between 1975 to 2020, but a huge amount of bad news, not about the fact that the world economy was growing faster than ever before from 1870 to today, but about the fact that the bad news, the growth was so unequally shared. Why? Well, let's start with the watershed, with the 1870 inflection point. As of 1870, had the British Industrial Revolution raised the standard of living or lightened the toil of the working class in England, the country at the center of the economic explosion? Not by much. Why not? Because Malthusian forces were still powerful. A richer country had led to people being better nourished and had led to a population explosion. And thus, smaller farm sizes would result from any improvement in human technological knowledge about the control of nature and the organization of humans. The smaller farm sizes produced by larger populations would reduce productivity. Thus, while human technological knowledge, capital H, would increase and could increase significantly, human labor efficiency, capital E, would not. And the pace of technological and organizational change was not that fast. It had certainly not been fast enough in the glacial progress ages before 1770 to upset this macro-Malthusian dynamic. And it had not even been fast enough between 1800 and 1870 to raise incomes high enough, even in Britain, to force the demographic transition in which people are confident enough that their babies will live that they stop trying to have a lot of them and break the mold of this Malthusian system. And from this, I think, comes the permanent and paramount world historical importance of the changes of 1870. Around the year 1870, in the generation between 1860 and 1880, our worldwide lowercase h proportional rate of growth in the value of the stock of human technological knowledge about the control of nature and the organization of humans, that pace of proportional growth goes from about 0.45% per year worldwide in terms of useful ideas discovered, developed, and deployed, to 2.1% per year. And it has stuck there since. Instead of it requiring 150 years for humanity's collective technological powers to control nature and organize ourselves productively to double, it requires only 35. And there it sticks. Well, until possibly this rate of growth drops off starting a decade ago, but that is a subject for another briefing. The principal cause of the speed up, I think, very much is the coming of the modern industrial research lab and the growth of the STEM labor force that made the process of discovering and developing and then providing proof of concept of new productive technological ideas a routine and a routinized and a rationalized one. Before, individual inventors and scientists had to discover things, and then to develop them, and then to market them, and then to deploy them, rather than focusing on what they were good at, discovery. Then, in addition, there was the coming of the modern corporation that made the process of developing and then deploying new technological ideas on a global scale a routine and routinized and rationalized one at all. Instead of a really good idea being deployed in one factory run by one entrepreneur with others looking on and trying to copy, the large modern corporation can simply send its engineers around and scale. Was the growth of the STEM labor force, the development of the industrial research lab, and the coming of the modern corporation inevitable? Was it baked in the cake as a result of what went down during the 1770 to 1870 British Industrial Revolution era? Or might we have as a species have missed the path to this circa 1870 economic engineering technological breakthrough? This is a deep question that we do not have good answers to. I tend to say that it was not baked in the cake, at least not by anything that had happened in the first two-thirds, 1770 to 1840, of the British Industrial Revolution century. And that if you'd sat in, say, 1840, you might have equally well predicted an ebb of the tide of the Industrial Revolution and a slowing of technological advance once the macro inventions of steam power and automatic textile machinery and metallurgy had been played out, rather than another wave, another speed up, and subsequent waves. Why do I think this? Well, again, this is a topic for another time. But because arguments that the speed up to modern economic growth to 2.1% per year was baked in the cake tend, I think, to lead us to have expected another two or more speed ups in the rate of growth of human technological progress in lowercase h since. And we have not had such. But now I get to the main event of this briefing, assisting the STEM Lab Corporation trio in discontinuously and substantially boosting the pace of human technological powered growth around 1870 was globalization. Globalization of goods through trade, using railroads and iron-hulled steamships. Globalization of people through migration, again using railroads and iron-hulled steamships. Globalization of communications, using the telegraph, both land-based and submarine. Yet somehow, in spite of globalization, and in spite of the fact that globalization has been a huge deal in boosting the speed of technological advance worldwide, somehow at least the first century of the post-1870 modern economic growth era has seen divergence big time. While economic and political economic processes have seen the global north develop massively, they have also seen the emergence of these enormous income and productivity gaps between the global north and the global south. And while the global north has been developed, the global south has been underdevelopment. That India was a massive manufacturing powerhouse in 1770. Indian industry as a share of the world's was effectively negligible in 1975. China was a massive manufacturing powerhouse in its share of global industry in 1770. By 1975, China's industry, too, was an absolutely trivial proportion of global manufacturing. And China and India were not global south outliers here. The global south has a grasp of, in 1975 especially, had grasp, and even today, had grasp of a lot smaller a fraction of the human technological cornucopia, our stock of ideas, big H, than it had hold of in 1870, or indeed at any time earlier. Now, the jump in proportional growth, the jump in lowercase h, and the proportional growth of our technological competence, from 0.45% per year to 2.1% per year around 1870, it meant that when in 1914 people looked back, that they saw the years since 1970 as John Maynard Keynes called it, looking back from 1919 at a little book he wrote that made him famous, called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, made it an economic El Dorado. 1870 to 1914 as a previously unseen and unimagined epoch of expansion in global wealth and prosperity, visually nearly everywhere, all over the globe. And it is what happened in those years that I think set us on the track to the extraordinarily unequal world we have today. In some ways, the world economy as it stood in the era of World War I was remarkably modern. This was true in heavy industries especially. In 1913, Britain burned 200 million tons of coal. Total coal equivalent energy consumption in Britain today is less than 3 times as large. Average U.S. passenger railroad miles in 1913 were 350 miles per person. The average American thus spent 10 hours a year on a train, getting someplace at a distance and at a speed beyond the wildest imaginings of previous centuries, save for miracle tales, like the one, say, in which an angel picks up the prophet Habakkuk by the hair and carries him from Jerusalem to Babylon to feed the prophet Daniel a bowl of stew that Habakkuk had just cooked. Today, or rather back before 2020, average U.S. airline miles per year were 3,000 per person. Today we travel 10 times as fast and 10 times as far on average by modern transportation, mass transportation. But the quantum leap is between 1800 and 1914, not between 1914 and today. In other ways, however, even the global north was desperately poor and pre-modern back then. Do not exaggerate the changes back between 1870 and 1914, even in the most advanced parts. Agriculture, even in North America, was still largely unmechanized. More than half of Americans were still working on the farm. Only Britain and Belgium had less than half of their labor force in agriculture, and that was not because their food was grown via mechanized agriculture, but because their manufacturing exports allowed them to have the farmers who grew by hand the crops that fed them be located in other parts of the world with more abundant and better land, i.e., North America and the southern cone of South America. Recall, in the years before World War I, nitrogen artificial fertilizers were still largely just a gleam in the eye. People still worked like dogs on islands in the South Pacific to mine the products of avian defecation off of the offshores of Chile and Peru, and then ship the guano back to Europe as fertilizer. Guano king was an occupation and description of more than one plutocrat in those days. And 1914 still saw throughout all the globe, save for the recent European settlement English-speaking lands of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States, the remarkably thorough political dominance of people we can only call landlord aristocrats. People who generally feared being creatively destroyed by economic, political, and sociological change, or at least destroyed in their social roles. Indeed, people who had lost or were rapidly losing any claim to performing any valuable social role at all. They were hardly going to defend the king and the people with their swords, after all. And so they stoked the flames of nationalism and rolled the dice of war in order to busy giddy minds with foreign quarrels, as Shakespeare has his illegitimate Lancastrian King Henry IV, while dying, advise his son, the future King Henry V, and so distract the thoughts of those they wanted to have remain their underlings from ideas like socialism, progressive taxation, and expanded government provision of commodities. But the connection between technological change, economic growth, economic destabilization, and the horrors of war and genocide and tyranny in the 20th century, that is also a talk for another day. Let me go back to globalization. For one of the key factors that made the 20th century what it was, and one of the true keys to the underdevelopment of the global South, was the course that migration took over 1870 to 1914. During the half-century before World War I, 100 million people, 100 million people left their continents of origin. 70 million of them permanently. They did so because of the iron-hulled, screw-propellered, ocean-going steamship. After 1870, a steerage class ticket for a transatlantic voyage from Liverpool to New York took 9 days and cost only about 1.5 of a month's wages for an unskilled European worker. Pay 1.5 of a month's wages, or have a relative already in the New World pay 3/4 of a month's wages for the journey, and you double your pay or your children's pay. Now, wages were lower in China and India, and so costs were proportionately higher. But the wage gaps were as large. Cantonese for San Francisco is still Gold Mountain. Not 1.5 months, but 6 months. But then not beyond what a clan could scrape together to send a member across the ocean. And so 50 million people from Europe and 50 million people from Asia changed continents from 1870 to 1914. Now, this was an absolute bonanza for those who made the voyage. And this was a relief for those back home in Europe who found resources less crowded and scarce, although not much for those back in China and India. That migration was only a drop in the bucket. But this was also one of the principal sources of today's global inequality. A reason why the global South back then found itself as a whole leveled down to the Chinese and Indian standard. For China and India were then in the down poverty-stricken phase of the Malthusian cycle. And the development of underdevelopment in the global South, that can be understood only as a consequence of these waves of migration. Think of it. This great migration wave, it was also a big reason that the United States of America became truly exceptional throughout the 20th century. Only America's welcoming of migration, and Germany's lack of the land and thus the living standards to absorb migrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, and lack of a culture of assimilation as well, and the British Empire's lack of the will and the desire to absorb Eastern and Southern European migrants, gave America the demographic heft it needed for it to become the world's dominant century hyperpower, as it became the country to fill a particular niche. Let me call this niche that of Saxon notionally descended superpower. That is, Germans are not really Saxons, and British are not really Anglo-Saxons, and Americans are definitely not really Anglo-Saxons. But all of the countries have liked to think of themselves as in some sense such for much of the 20th century. And indeed, the language is that of the Saxons, or descended from that of the Saxons, in its core. You see, and let me digress for a while, back in the days of the decline of the Roman Empire, there was indeed a tribe of people called the Saxons, which means big knife guys. Probably not people you wanted to have as neighbors, if that's what their neighbors called them and what they called themselves. Some of them crossed the North Sea to Britain, others stayed in Germany. In Germany today, there are 3 counties named after the Saxons: Essex, Sussex, and Middlesex, plus there is an Earl of Wessex. In Germany, there are 3 Länder named after the Saxons: Niedersachsen, Saxon, and Saxon-Anhalt. In the United States, there are 5 Essexes, or is it 5 Essex? It's not clear what the plural is. Since it's German, it's probably Essexen. 5 Essexen, 4 Middlesexen, and 3 Sussexen counties. And I have not looked at Canada, Australia, or New Zealand. That makes 18 counties, plus an earldom, named for the original tribe in the land in the Anglo-Saxons, or those who call themselves notionally to some degree Anglo-Saxons and Saxons today, from whom the core of the common language spoken in those countries are. Now, of these people's three realms back in 1800, the British Empire had 17 million European-descended subjects, plus Indians, Africans, descendants of Africans, others whom the empire was not interested in educating, not interested in making citizens, not interested in bringing into the political community, and so who would not be a source of strength for the realm in the long run, but rather a subjugated people whom it could hold resources, to cost resources to hold down so they could exploit it, and which boosted living standards, but not in any sense geopolitical weight or geopolitical social power. That was the way it was. The kingdom of the lands that would become modern Germany had 15 million such potential full citizens. The United States had 4 million. And all of the United States and Britain were going to be welcome to take what European immigrants they got and make them full citizens as well, over the course of the 2 centuries after 1800. People from outside Europe, not so much. The United States in 1800 had 6 million people. 4 million European descended, 1.5 million African Americans, 500,000 Amerindians, whom, like the British Empire, the rulers of the United States were not interested in educating, but were interested in subjugating, and thus who would not be a source of strength for global social power, but rather a source of resources exploited from them, and who cost resources to hold down. So back in 1800, if we were going to say that at least one of these 3 countries is highly likely to become the world's hyperpower in the 20th century, that France, Spain, Italy and company, and Russia and China and India are too far away from the centers of industrialization for them to make a play, to become in some sense dominant, to become in some sense hegemons of how the world political economy and political military order worked. You'd have said that Britain was ahead of Germany, not so much by virtue of its population, but by view of its lead in industry, while the U.S. was nowheresville. By 1840, you'd have said the Saxon language group speaking population that the empire was willing and was interested in educating and making full citizens. 28 million in the British Empire, 27 million in the German states, and 13 million in America. The edge still in Britain, again by virtue of its industrialization, although the U.S. was catching up fast. And by 1870, the full citizen Saxon language group speaking populations were the about to be formed German Empire with 41 million, the British Empire with 37, and America with 33 million full citizens, with the U.S. catching up very fast, both because of natural increase and waves of immigration from the British Empire in the wake of the Irish potato famine, and from Germany as well. You'd have said that the future, if you were doing macro geopolitical, geoeconomic projections, the race looked pretty even. But by 1913, things were different. America had a small edge in industrialization over Britain and Germany, and America had taken the full citizen population edge substantially. 83 million full citizens, as opposed to 67 in Germany and 59 in Britain, a 25% edge to America. By 1939, America would have a 42% larger full citizen population than Germany and a 50% population edge over the British Empire's full citizens. And without the U.S.'s welcome to Eastern and Southern European migrants, that would not have happened. And then the 20th century would have been much less of an American century. But the full story of the 20th century, of the American century, of America has hegemon. That's also for another day. And now, finally, let me get on to what I really wanted to talk about 40 minutes ago when I started this. What role did migration and the rest of globalization play in the underdevelopment of the global South, in the development of its underdevelopment? Okay, so 50 million left from China and India to places from South Asia and Africa to the Caribbean and the highlands of Peru. Peru in the late 20th century could have a president named Fujimori. The author V.S. Naipaul was born not in India but in the Caribbean. The redwood forests of Northern California contain shrines to the Bodhisattva Guan Yin. Never before or since have we seen such a rapid proportional redistribution of humanity around the globe. The redwood forests of Northern California, the attempt of migration from China to European settled California and to the rest of the temperate climate settler colonies and ex-colonies, that was very quickly shut down. Plutocrats like Leland Stanford, the railroad baron and governor of California who founded and endowed Stanford University in memory of his son, favored immigration. The populists favored exclusion and Chinaman go home. In the temperate zone economies to which migrants from Europe went, the populists won out before World War I in one narrow respect, with respect to making and keeping settler colonies, quote, European, unquote. Asian immigrants were effectively kept out of what Arthur Lewis called the temperate countries of European settlement. The United States, Canada, Australia, Chile, Uruguay, Australia, and New Zealand, they had an opportunity to join Western Europe in what is today's global north. Although Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay fumbled the opportunity, that's also for another briefing, and Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan so far joined the global north. That's also for another briefing. Instead, the flow of migrants out of China and India was directed elsewhere, to the tea plantations of Ceylon or the rubber plantations of Malaysia. Now, migration out did not raise wages much in the migration source economies of China and India. They were so large, relatively in population, that emigration was a drop in the bucket in terms of allowing for larger farm sizes. But migration did lower relative wages in tropical zone recipient economies by a lot. And migration from China and India lowered relative wages in tropical zone economies that never saw a migrant. British capital, Brazilian stock rubber plants, and labor imported from China to Malaya could and did put heavy downward pressure on the wages and economic development of Brazil of people who did not know there was such a place as Malaya. And worth noting in all of this is the role played by the British Empire. The comparative advantage of the regions that were to become the periphery of the late 19th century global economy were not so much given as made. Where the British went, they built a fort, some docks, and a botanical garden. The botanical garden to discover what valuable plants grown elsewhere might flourish there as well. During the 19th century, the rubber plant came to Malaysia, the tea shrub came to Ceylon, and the coffee bush came to Brazil. Rubber was not introduced into Malaysia, Indonesia, and Indochina until the last quarter of the 1800s. But by the end of World War I, these three regions had become the principal sources of the world's natural rubber supply, greatly to the detriment of the economic development of Brazil. India and China, you see, through ill luck and bad government, had not escaped the Malthusian devil as of 1900. Technology had advanced. The population of China in the late 1800s was some 3 times what it had been in the year 1000. And living standards were no, or at least not much lower than then. But improvements in productive potential had been absorbed in rising populations and not in rising living standards. So potential migrants from China and India were willing to move far for what seemed to Europeans and others around the globe to be starvation wages. Thus, the large populations and low levels of material wealth and agricultural productivity, given small farm sizes in China and India, those checked the growth of wages in any of the areas. Malaysia, Indonesia, the Caribbean, or East Africa opened to the Asian migration stream. Workers could be cheaply imported and employed to wages not that far above the physical subsistence level. These workers would be very happy with their jobs. Their opportunities and living standards in Malaysian or African plantations would be significantly above what they could expect if they returned to India or China. Low wage costs meant that commodities produced in countries open to Asian immigration were relatively cheap. And competition from the Malaysian rubber plantations checked growth and even pushed down wages in the Brazilian rubber tappers as well. The late 19th century saw living standards and wage rates become and remain relatively low, although higher outside than inside China and India, throughout the regions that were to become what is today's global south. And as wages in economies that were to become the global periphery were checked, the prospects for having a rich enough middle class to provide demand for a strong domestic industrial sector ebbed rapidly. As a result, the chain of causation went roughly like this. 1. The openness of some places for tropical goods could be produced, pushed down their prices in world markets. The openness to migration of some of the places in which tropical goods could be produced pushed down their prices in world markets. 2. Low prices for tropical goods in world markets meant low wages everywhere tropical goods were produced. 3. Low wages meant no prosperous middle class anywhere tropical goods were produced. 4. No prosperous middle class meant no mass domestic demand for manufacturers. 5. No mass domestic demand for manufacturers meant no chance of starting industrialization. 6. No chance of starting industrialization meant no building a community of engineering practice. 7. No community of engineering practice meant no taking the next step in advancing industrialization. 8. No advancing in industrialization meant no walking onto the escalator to modernity and prosperity. With Japan being the only country able to avoid this particular trap. That also is a story for another briefing. That, in a nutshell, is the story of how 1870 to 1914 set the world on the path of the relative underdevelopment of the Global South. It was not that globalization left the Global South alone in the years before World War I. Rather, globalization profoundly transformed the Global South. But it was that the form that globalization took put it on a road that made its industrialization much, much more difficult. Even though the openness of world markets made it more prosperous, made the Global South more prosperous in that pre-World War I half-century, that people back then rightly saw as one of global progress, as a global El Dorado. And it is our collective inability to recover from the consequences of the globalization of 1870 to 1914 that has given us a world so unequal today. Albeit less unequal today, although more grossly unequal within countries than it was back in 1975. Why were we unable to recover? Well, again, I have only guesses. My guesses are colonization and then the shock of decolonization. But that also is a topic for another briefing. This briefing is already much longer than long enough. And so let me say goodbye by saying that this is the DeLongTODAY broadcast briefing. I am Brad DeLong, and thank you all very much for watching.